It's too quiet.
This review is about a game called Doorways, but I'd like to take a moment to draw a comparison to a game you're even less likely to have heard of called Dream Killer. Dream Killer is a very simple swarm shooter in the tradition of Painkiller, where you go into a room, slaughter loads of enemies, and then proceed to the next where you do the same thing. It's not really any good, but it's also surprisingly bullshit-free. The only possible exception to that is the closest thing it has to a gimmick. It's B-movie pseudo-psychology and basic symbolism. You play as a hot lesbian therapist who can go into the minds of her patients and alleviate their deepest problems by blasting really simple representations of those problems into chunks. Say there's a guy with an aversion to the cold, so his level and enemies are themed around icy conditions. Say there's an arachnophobe, so his enemies are themed around spiders, that is to say they are spiders. Once you've completed a level, you've saved your patient and you move on to the next. Doorways seems very similar to this, and I feel the need to compare it to Dream Killer instead of simply viewing it on its own because it's very vague in describing itself. As best I can understand it, you embody just some protagonist, either working for a secret organization called Doorways, or utilizing some fantastical science device of the same name. You enter the mind of a criminal, and you explore a bizarre representation of his crimes until it ends, and supposedly you catch him. The main difference between Doorways and Dream Killer is genre, of course, so instead of shooting problems with a minigun, you're doing really basic horror-themed point-and-click adventure stuff with tiny action elements like platforming thrown in. Despite it being a game with roots in both horror and point-and-click adventuring, it's the least interesting story about catching sick killers I've experienced in quite a while. Currently, there are 2 out of 4 total planned chapters released, and the one thing that's actually interesting about them is their mood. There is no formal introduction to the environment you move through. Instead, you just go into somebody's mind, and it's actually attention-grabbing at first. The visuals aren't impressive on a technical level, but the aesthetic of the game's environments is crooked and dark, as though at least one person on the development team knew what he was doing. It's immediately alien and surprisingly unafraid to employ pitch darkness and strange ambient noises. It's the kind of imposing aesthetic that makes you tread lightly before you know anything about the game, and in this case, before you realize how trivial the gameplay is. Unfortunately, although the visuals manage to feel inspired by the characters you are supposedly hunting, every other element couldn't feel less invested in the subject matter. It's all just assorted, disjointed, uninteresting stuff that you have to do until the game tells you that it's over, set to a poorly translated script that doesn't recognize the show-don't-tell ideal. I suppose the most surefire way to describe the design of the moment-to-moment gameplay is simply to lay out some of the progression through it. The first chapter, for example, is about a professor who kidnaps and tortures people with old torture equipment. And the gameplay represents this at first by leading you through a linear, spiky forest with a torch that constantly needs to be relit. If you're caught in the dark between points where you can light your torch again, the game plays a screamer at you and then makes you start over. You soon find yourself doing simplistic platforming over a wooden dock in a terrible state of disrepair in the middle of a dark, endless void. Then you come up to a castle filled with hanging cages, where you have to step on tiles in a certain sequence, or else be impaled by spikes. Finally, you reach the supposed meat of the chapter, that is, the only relevant level, the criminal's gritty torture basement, where your task is to put things in places. You find missing parts for the various torture machines in the basement, and you put them on the torture machines. Each completed machine prompts a short torture cutscene, and then the level is over. Whoopee. Doorways tries in a way to make up for how disjointedly the levels are themed through its script, but it tries way too hard. You don't need a degree in anything to see how moment-to-moment gameplay like the arbitrary platforming in Simon Says doesn't coalesce well with the idea of a twisted mind world. But when the art in the environments actually reflects the intended imposing nature of the sadistic killers you're hunting down, it's something in the game worth appreciating. Unfortunately, however, in all parts of the game, competent or incompetent on their own, the mood is telegraphed so overtly for the PewDiePie audience through its writing. In the duller moments, you can find sheets of paper lying around where your protagonist will just read off obnoxious bullet points, all about the negative auras of the people he's hunting down. In other cases, when there's appropriate and even clever symbolism in the level architecture, the messages you find lying around just love to glean any nuance out of it and state outright for your incompetent little noggin that symbol X represents concept Y. All of the notes you find are set to the voice of Sam Mowry, whom you may remember as Alexander from Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and it sounds like the only vocal direction he was given was, "Use your amnesia voice, this is totally our ace in the hole." But Alexander of Brennenburg as a well-meaning mind cop is quite a stretch. It's likely that the developers hoped his deep voice would make things inherently dramatic, but it's just a deep voice reading off translation errors and things that seem odd when read aloud, and it's probably something that you'll turn off.
J. Gibbs, London, England, 1962. Professor of History. Suspected for the kidnapping of 17 people, disappeared in the adjoining areas of a cabin owned by his family. The missing persons have in common certain indirect factors, religions or pagan practices, foreign nationality, that are not reason enough for the local police to start an investigation.
Doorway's most concerning problem, however, is really just that there is no plain old raw mechanical merit behind any of your objectives, to make either a fun challenge or a brooding atmosphere piece out of these first 2 chapters. Each chapter can last from 30 minutes to an hour, which doesn't leave a very good amount of time to expand on the gameplay elements it gives you. By the time you've jumped over only a few gaps, it tells you to go drag some objects around for a few minutes before it finds some other basal gameplay element to fling at you like a set piece. Similarly, as a game reliant on its horror atmosphere, it falls incredibly short. The environments could have gone a long way if aided by some sort of mechanical depth, but the only presence of a horror element in the game's mechanics boils down to shock triggers tied to some trial and error gameplay. In the previously mentioned timed segments where you have to keep your torch lit while traveling through darkness, for example, the consequence for failure is death at the hands of a lady who appears out of nowhere and screams at you. There are no dynamic moments that provoke a desire for survival or caution like monster encounters in Penumbra, just rather transparent, cheap ways of telling you that you lost. Perhaps the real distinction I should make between Doorways and Dreamkiller is bullshit. Story and symbolism matter so little in a first-person shooter that's as dumb and singularly focused as Dreamkiller. But the same approach taken toward those elements in what is mostly a horror point-and-click adventure game is a serious detractor. Story and world design lay fundamentally at the heart of adventure gaming, and apart from its aesthetic, Doorways puts minimal effort into either element. Neither of the 2 games I'm mentioning is actually worth playing, but despite the conceptual similarities, the shooter has an advantage here, a story element that's totally inconsequential. Doorways is insulting, thinly veiled, pseudo-intellectual bullshit right down to its core, on top of just not being any fun to play.